And continuing on with our look back at Occupy, some interesting developments are starting to be made public that we want to discuss. Now, you may remember one of the issues many Occupy protesters spoke about over the last year was their concern that they were being surveilled by police. Now, of course, many movements around the country, members of these movements actually spoke with police on a daily basis. However, some activists we spoke to said they believe police officers were going undercover, taking notes, collecting information about them. Activists which would then be turned over to authorities. Well, it turns out those so-called conspiracies may in fact have been accurate. The American Civil Liberties Union has obtained initial documents they had to file a lawsuit to get their hands on. And contained in these documents, information about surveillance of Occupy demonstrations. I'm joined now by Linda Lai, attorney with the ACLU of Northern California. And Linda, first tell me about this process of just trying to get this information. What did the ACLU have to go through?
Thank you so much for having us here. The ACLU of Northern California, in conjunction with a local independent newspaper, the San Francisco Bay Guardian, filed a Freedom of Information Act request on the FBI to find out whether, in fact, all of the suspicions of FBI surveillance were, in fact, true. We got no response for a while. And so in July, we sued in federal court. Not too long after we filed a lawsuit, the FBI produced documents, an initial set, which do two things. Somewhat not surprisingly, they confirmed that the FBI has in fact been keeping tabs on the Occupy movement. But what was much more interesting was what the FBI refused to hand over. They acknowledged that additional documents exist, but that they were not going to provide us with them, invoking several what are called exemptions under the Freedom of Information Act, one of those reasons being national security.
Yeah, there seems to be a whole page of exemptions listed in some of these documents. Let's start first, Linda, with the focus of the documents that were released. From what I gathered, it seemed to be on the Port of Oakland shutdown in November and the West Coast ports shut down in December. Any indication why these events were, important for the Department of Homeland Security to send in the troops, so to speak?
The documents we got were from the FBI. There's a separate group, the Partnership for Civil Justice in D.C., that has done fabulous work, some FOIAs to DHS. The Partnership for Civil Justice did obtain documents showing that DHS was quite involved. The documents we obtained were from the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, which has a history of spying on domestic activists. What we wanted to know is whether that tradition, that unhappy tradition, continues to this day. Somewhat not surprisingly, the FBI was keeping tabs on the various then upcoming port shutdowns.
So you were saying before, a few documents were released, I think 13 pages worth, but you were saying what was really interesting was the fact that they said they had 37 pages just on this topic alone, on Occupy surveillance. Talk a little bit about the significance of this.
So there were additional pages that they did not produce, and two things I think are especially interesting about them. One, they held back some of the documents based on supposed national security. Now, if Occupy really implicates national security, one would suspect that the FBI has in its possession more than 37 pages. Two, why is a political protest movement a matter of national security? It's not very surprising to us that the FBI would invoke the sort of ordinary law enforcement exemptions. That's a standard thing it does in most of these cases. But national security really ratchets it up to a different level. National security is usually what you'd expect to see if we're trying to get spy satellite photo images of nuclear reactors. But obviously, we're not asking for anything of that sort. Our concern is that the FBI is treating political protest like a threat to national security when political protest is actually not a threat, it's our nation's lifeblood.
Of course, hindsight is always 20/20, but what do you make of so many people when they heard people, these activists say, we think we're being surveilled? So many people said, you guys are crazy, you guys are, conspiracy theorists. Why do you think so many people didn't believe Occupy protesters when they thought that they were being spied on?
It's hard for me to speculate, but what we really wanted to do was see if there's concrete proof. And people who had concern that the feds were keeping tabs on them had justification for being worried about that.
Is there anything that can be done about this? I mean, are there any steps that some of these activists can take to, fight back, or is there anything that can happen to make sure this doesn't continue, or is this just kind of how it's going to be?
So one thing people can do is actually submit a Freedom of Information Act Privacy Act request to see if if the FBI has set up an individual file on them. The FBI's website is actually relatively good at sort of do-it-yourself Freedom of Information Act requests. So if folks are concerned that the FBI have started a file on them, submit a FOIA Privacy Act request to find out. And the reason why it's important to do this is to hold our government accountable. The FBI has guidelines for how it can and should operate. Several years ago, the Department of Justice Inspector General did an audit of the FBI to see if it was complying with the guidelines that are supposed to control how the FBI conducts investigations, and the FBI came up short. Having concrete information, rather than just concerns and speculation, having concrete information is really important if we are to hold our decision makers accountable.
Of course, today is the one-year anniversary of when the Occupy Wall Street movement began. And this topic is a very important one. But while I have you here, Linda, I want to sort of take this and make it a little broader. I know that you wrote a couple months ago about sealed judicial documents. You said there are tens of thousands of these kept by the FBI. What is the ACL's biggest concerns about this?
It's an enormous concern that the government is consistently applying for what are called location tracking orders under seal. It's relatively common in the course of a criminal investigation that the government will go to court and ask for a search warrant or other kind of order in order to justify getting information about the suspect of an investigation. During the pendency of an investigation, there are legitimate reasons for why that has to remain under seal in order to preserve the integrity of the investigation. But once the investigation has closed, there's no longer the same justification for keeping those orders under seal. In the area of location tracking, a particular form of electronic surveillance where the law is constantly evolving and the government is trying to get away with more than the public maybe feel comfortable with, than the law may tolerate, it's essential that the public and the decision makers in Congress and our state legislatures have an understanding of just what kinds of electronic surveillance is happening. New technology is evolving. There are new methods of tracking us. And so it's essential that this sort of process happen by light of public day rather than under cover of night.
I don't want to say the ACLU is the only organization fighting this. There are certainly other great organizations that do an awesome job. But I'm wondering, Linda, why you think this isn't a bigger deal, why this isn't a campaign issue, something that the majority of people in this country care about, and that is what you just talked about, electronic surveillance.
I am so delighted you've asked that question. It's a question I ask myself all the time. There was a very brave judge in Texas about 4 years ago who started raising the profile of this, what I find to be shocking issue of secret dockets in courts, where courts are granting the federal government the authority to engage in all kinds of surveillance, and it's all happening under seal. So there's a basic First Amendment right, a common law tradition in this country of access to the courts. We hold trials in public, we hold judicial proceedings in public. So the idea that in a very controversial and evolving area of law, electronic surveillance, the idea that this kind of judicial decision-making would be happening in secret, it's shocking that in 2012 this is happening in our country.
Absolutely. Great to have you on the show. Linda Lai, attorney with the ACLU of Northern California.
Thank you so much. Happy birthday, Occupy.